It began with silence, not the comfortable silence of an empty house, or a quiet morning before the world stirs, not the silence of peace, which carries within it the so-feet suggestion that nothing is coming, that the stillness will continue a little longer. It was a different kind of silence, an occupied silence, the kind that has weight, that presses against the ears and the chest with the specific gravity of something waiting to be broken. It began, as most things of consequence begin, with a man lying very still. He was pressed against the earth on the chalk cliffs above the Normandy coast, his body shaped into the contours of a shallow scrape in the soil, his breathing slow and measured, the kind of breathing you learn not in a classroom, but in the long hours of having nothing to do but remain invisible. The scope of his carabiner 98,000 was cold against his cheek. The glass gathered light from a sky still undecided between night and day. That particular hour before dawn when the world exists as gradations of grey rather than defined shapes, when the sea below looks less like water and more like a dark field that trembles slightly at its edges. He had been lying there for 3 hours. He would lie there for many more. This is a story about stillness in the face of motion, about precision in the face of chaos, about a single human perspective lodged like a splinter inside the largest military operation the world has ever seen, a perspective that history has rarely asked for, that the triumphant narratives of June 6th, 1944 rarely make room for, because history tends to be written from the side that wins. And the men who lay in their carefully constructed positions along the Norman coast, watching the impossible happen across the distance of their rifle scopes, did not win. They endured. They calculated. They aimed and breathed and squeezed. They did what they had been trained to do in the face of a tide so vast it made the very mathematics of military planning seem like a child's arithmetic. It began with silence, and then, across the water, across the dark channel, it stopped being silent, and nothing was ever the same again. There is a kind of soldier that war produces almost reluctantly, as if acknowledging that the machinery of organized violence requires a particular kind of crayfeetsman alongside its engineers, and its logistics officers and its infantry commanders. The sniper exists at an oblique angle to the rest of military culture. He is alone when others move in formation. He is patient when others are urgent. He inhabits time differently, measured not in the advance of units across a map, but in the long meditative intervals between heartbeats, in the fractional second between trigger pull and consequence, in the hours of watching that precede the single moment of action. The German snipers who looked out from the Atlantic Wall fortifications on the morning of June 6th, 1944 were inheritors of a tradition that the Wehrmacht had developed through 4 years of war, through the desperate winters of the Eastern Front, through the rubble of Stalingrad, through the careful, lethal patience of the hedgerow fighting in other theatres. They were men who had learned to subordinate the self entirely to the task, men who understood that their value lay not in the act of firing, but in the quality of the waiting that preceded it. They were also men who were afraid, profoundly, quietly, entirely afraid, because what was coming toward them across the English Channel in the early hours of June 6, 1944, was not something that could be resolved by patience and precision. It was something that could only be faced. And they faced it from inside the mathematics of a scope, from behind the cold steel of a German rifle, from the particular loneliness of a position that no one was coming to reinforce. They faced it, and they did their jobs, and the day unfolded around them like a catastrophe unfolding in slow motion around a man who cannot move. This is their story. If you're still here, if you've settled in, and let the day step back a little, if these long, unhurried journeys into the darker corners of human history help you find a quieter place in your thoughts, then I want to ask something small. Subscribe if you haven't, not as a transaction, but as a gesture. When you subscribe, you help keep this kind of careful, unhurried storytelling alive, the kind that doesn't rush past the difficult parts, the kind that sits with the uncomfortable perspectives as long as they deserve. These stories need space to breathe. Your support gives them that space. Settle in, let the day go. This is D-Day from the other side of the gun. The spring of 1944 smelled of chalk and salt and human industry. Along the 2,000 kilometers of the Atlantic Wall, that vast, incomplete, deeply uneven fortification system that stretched from the Norwegian fjords to the Spanish border, the smell of concrete curing in the sea air had become as familiar as the smell of food, of cigarettes, of the particular domestic musk of men living in close quarters inside structures designed for endurance rather than comfort. It is important to understand what the Atlantic Wall actually was, because what it actually was differs substantially from what it was claimed to be. German propaganda, and to a considerable degree German military briefing documents, described it as a fortification of immense and impenetrable continuity, a concrete spine running the length of occupied Europe's western coast, a wall in the most literal sense, bristling with artillery and manned by a determined and adequately supplied force capable of repelling any invasion the Allies might dare to attempt. This description was, in significant measure, a fiction. The Atlantic Wall was real in places. It was extraordinarily real along certain stretches of coastline, particularly the Pas-de-Calais, the narrow strait between France and England that the German High Command correctly identified as the most logical invasion route, and therefore the place they poured their concrete and their political will and their limited building resources in the greatest concentration. But Normandy was different. Normandy was not the Pas-de-Calais. Normandy was what the Germans considered the secondary option, the longer shot, the invasion route that would require the Allies to cross a wider stretch of channel and land on beaches less obviously suited to a rapid breakout. Normandy received fortifications, but it received them with a fraction of the urgency, the material and the manpower that the Pas-de-Calais received. The Atlantic Wall in Normandy was less a wall and more a series of strong points, Widerstands Nester, resistance nests, connected by wire and telephone line, and the logic of interlocking fields of fire, but separated by stretches of coastline, where a determined assault might find the seams between positions and push through before the defenders could close them. This was the inheritance of the men who lay in those positions on the morning of June 6, 1944. They defended not a wall, but a series of carefully prepared arguments against invasion, placed at the most logical points, entrusted with the responsibility of holding long enough for reserves to arrive, the reserves that would never arrive in time, the arguments that the sea itself would come to overwhelm. The 716th Infantry Division held the coastal sector that would become Omaha and Gold Beaches. They were what the Wehrmacht classified as a static division, a designation that carries within it an entire institutional biography. Static divisions were not the armoured spearhead formations, not the elite Fallschirmjäger, not the SS divisions with their considerable, if terrible, battlefield reputations. They were older men, men with health conditions that made them unsuitable for the mobile warfare of the Eastern Front, men from the occupied territories whose loyalty was considered adequate, if not inspiring. Men who had been in these positions long enough that the distinction between garrison duty and combat readiness had begun to blur at the edges. The 716th had been in Normandy since 1942, 2 years of watching an empty sea, 2 years of digging and reinforcing and standing watch, 2 years of waiting for something that kept not arriving. They had 17,000 men spread across a front of more than 40 kilometers. The mathematics of that distribution are worth sitting with for a moment. 17,000 men across 40 kilometers means, in the roughest terms, 425 men per kilometer. That sounds considerable, until you understand that those men were not distributed evenly, but concentrated in the resistance nests, leaving the intervals between positions thinly held at best, and essentially undefended at worst. It means each position, each bunker complex, each WNY to stands nest was an island of resistance, surrounded by ground that the defenders could observe, but not truly hold. The snipers were among the most carefully positioned of those men. They occupied what military planners call high-value positions, elevated points, concealed hides, locations where a single rifleman with a quality optic and sufficient patience could influence a much larger tactical picture than his solitary presence might suggest. They were positioned with care by officers who understood the math of defended coastlines, that a sniper in the right position could delay an assault, disrupt command structures by targeting officers, complicate the enemy's ability to organize and advance, and, perhaps most importantly, extend the time during which the German position remained viable. Every minute of delay was a minute in which reserves might be moving, in which the tactical picture might shift, in which the mathematics might somehow resolve differently than they were beginning to appear. This was the theory. The theory assumed that the delay would be sufficient. The theory did not anticipate what the morning of June 6, 1944 would actually bring. The 5th of June 1944, the day before, Normandy, there is a specific kind of boredom that belongs to soldiers waiting for something that has been promised for a long time. It is not the boredom of idleness. The men along the Norman coast had not been idle. They had dug and reinforced and wired and rehearsed. They had carried concrete on their backs and sandbags on their shoulders. They had strung barbed wire through surf zones and seeded beaches with obstacles, the Belgian gates, the element sea barriers, the hedgehogs and stakes tipped with telemines, a forest of steel and wooden explosive that transformed the Norman beaches into a kind of arithmetic lesson for any assault force that tried to cross them. This work had been hard and continuous, and it had something of the quality of a very long sentence that had no period in sight. Disappear, both with amused pairing and continuous. You worked because working was the way you proved, to yourself and to your officers, that you were ready, and you were never quite ready, because the thing you were ready for hadn't come. Field Marshal Rommel had understood this dynamic better than most of the men under his command. When he took charge of Army Group B in early 1944 and made his inspection tours along the Atlantic Wall, what he found troubled him deeply, not because the men weren't trying, but because the gap between what the wall claimed to be and what it actually was had been papered over by years of official reassurance. He drove the length of the coast in his staff car, looking at the positions with the eyes of a man who had conducted assault operations, and therefore understood the problem from the attacker's side. And what he saw was a series of islands in a sea of weakness. Strong positions, very strong positions in some places, but not a wall. A wall has no gaps. What he was looking at had gaps that an experienced assault force could find and exploit. And the army assembled in England was not an inexperienced assault force. He had set about trying to close the gaps with the specific urgency of a man who believed, rightly, as events would confirm, that the outcome of the entire war would be determined in the first 24 hours of the Allied landing. His theory was that the panzers needed to be positioned close to the coast, because the first hours were the only hours in which the landing force would be most vulnerable, strung out between the water and the beach, without room to maneuver, their armour and artillery still at sea or struggling through the surf. Drive them back into the sea in those first hours, and the invasion fails. Wait, as his superior von Rundstedt preferred, hold the panzers inland as an operational reserve to counterattack after the landing was established, and you gave the Allies time to get their logistics ashore, and their formations organised and their air cover fixed over the battlefield. Wait, and you fought the battle that the Allies had planned for. Strike immediately, and you fought your battle. he was overruled. The panzers were held inland. The debate between Rommel and von Rundstedt on this question, tactical commitment at the waterline versus operational reserve for counterattack, is one of the more consequential arguments in military history, and it was resolved by Hitler, who split the difference in the worst possible way, placing some panzers close enough to the coast to be committed quickly, but withholding others as an OKW reserve that required his personal authorization to release. This ensured that neither Rommel's vision nor von Rundstedt's was fully implemented. The panzers that were close enough to matter would be committed too late. The panzers that were held back would arrive too slowly. The beach defences would fight their battle alone, with whatever they had, for as long as they could hold. This was the strategic context that the man in the concrete emplacement above Omaha Beach did not know and could not have known. He knew his position. He knew his sector. He knew the interlocking fields of fire. He knew where the machine guns were, and where the artillery was, and where the wire was, and where the gaps in the wire were that had been leaf feet open as withdrawal routes. He knew the German military doctrine for coastal defence, and the specific tactical plan for his section of the Atlantic Wall. He did not know that the plan's success depended on reserves that would not come. He knew what he needed to know to do his job. The rest of it lived above the level of his concern. The forecast had been bad. This is one of the small, profound ironies of the largest military operation in human history, that it was the weather which made the final decision. The meteorological situation over the English Channel in early June 1944 was unsettled, marked by the passage of low-pressure systems that piled waves onto the Norman beaches and drove clouds low across the sky, limiting visibility, complicating naval navigation, making the prospect of a beach landing seem even more hazardous than it already was. The German meteorologists had examined the same weather data and reached a conclusion: no invasion would come in these conditions. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who commanded Army Group B, and therefore held responsibility for the coastal defence of France and the Low Countries, had departed for Germany on June 5th to celebrate his wife Lucy's birthday, confident that the weather made Allied action impossible for at least another 2 weeks. He was not alone in this assessment. The German 7th Army, responsible for the Norman coast, stood down a significant portion of its officers for exercises and meetings that seemed, on June 5th, to pose no risk. The sea was rough, the sky was grey, the English Channel was doing, from the German perspective, exactly what a defended channel ought to do, making itself inhospitable to men in boats. In the resistance nests along the Norman coast, the men on duty watched the rough sea and thought, with some measure of relief, that tonight at least nothing was going to happen. The relief was genuine but thin, the way most relief is when it rests on the absence of something rather than the presence of something good. They ate their evening meals, they made their tea, they wrote their letters. In the higher command structures, maps were being consulted not with urgency, but with the routine attention of men who had been waiting a long time, and expected to wait a while longer. One of those men was Gefreiter Werner Schreiber of the 916th Grenadier Regiment, a component of the 352nd Infantry Division that had been moved to reinforce the Norman coast in March 1944, a decision that would, in ways Schreiber could not then know, directly shape the catastrophe that would unfold the following morning at the beach the Allies called Omaha. Schreiber was 22 years old and had come to marksmanship through the practical education of the Eastern Front, where a man who could not hit what he aimed at generally did not survive long enough to develop other skills. He had a ZF-41 telescopic sight mounted on his Carabiner 98,000, a relatively modest piece of optics by later war standards, a 1.5 power scope that extended effective range without dramatically transforming the rifle's fundamental character. And he had killed, by his own account, confirmed by his unit's records, 14 men at distances between 200 and 800 meters before being transferred west in late 1943. He did not think of himself as a specialist. He was simply a soldier who shot accurately. In the Wehrmacht of 1944, this distinction mattered less and less. On the evening of June 5th, Schreiber ate black bread and a thin potato soup and drank ersatz coffee that tasted of nothing in particular, and he wrote a letter to his mother in Dusseldorf that described the weather and the sea and the general tedium of garrison life. And he went to his position in the reinforced concrete emplacement that overlooked a particular stretch of beach, and he looked out at the churning grey water, and he settled in to wait. He had been waiting since October 1943. He was good at waiting. Oberschütze Heinrich Baum was 28 and had arrived in Normandy by a different route, not the Eastern Front, but North Africa, where he had served with the 90th Light Division before the surrender in Tunisia in May 1943. He had been a prisoner of the British for 4 months, then exchanged as part of a prisoner arrangement, and had returned to Germany in late 1943. Thin and quieter than he had left feet, the experience of captivity had done something to his understanding of the war that he found difficult to articulate. But that expressed itself in a specific kind of attentiveness, a hypervigilance to the details of his situation, to the exits and the entrances, to the relative strengths and weaknesses of the positions he occupied. He had been assigned as a sniper not because of any exceptional formal training, but because a range assessment had revealed a natural accuracy that his commanding officer had decided was worth developing. He had been given his scope, and his position on the bluffs above the beach the Germans called Green Beach, and the Allies would designate Gold, and he had been told to wait and to watch and to be ready. He spent the evening of June 5th in conversation with a gunner named Gerhard, 20 years old, from Munich, who had never leafed Germany before being posted to Normandy, and who talked about Munich with the intensity of a man already homesick for a life he had not yet lost. They talked until about 11 at night. Then the sound of aircraft feet began. The aircraft feet came in waves. This requires some precision because the sound of aircraft feet over Normandy on the night of June 5 to 6 was not the first time German defenders had heard Allied aircraft feet overhead. The Allies had been bombing the Norman transport network and coastal batteries with increasing frequency for weeks, a preparatory bombardment that the Germans had noted with professional concern, but had interpreted, with some justification, as general disruption rather than invasion preparation. Aircraft feet overhead was not, by June 1944, a reliable indicator of imminent ground assault. But the sound of this aircraft feet was different. It was the volume of it, first of all. The number of aircraft feet passing overhead in the hours of feet to midnight on June 6th was not the sound of a bombing raid. It was the sound of a sky filled with aircraft feet, a low, continuous thunder that seemed to come from every direction at once, that did not diminish as a passing bomber formation would diminish, but built and built and built until it was less a sound than a presence, a vibration that moved through the concrete and the chalk and the bodies of the men pressed against their positions. 2,000 aircraft feet carrying 23,000 Allied paratroopers, the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions dropping into the western end of the invasion zone, the British 6th Airborne dropping on the eastern end, men falling from the sky above Normandy, while the sea below churned in the darkness, and the German defenders tried to make sense of what they were hearing. The German response to the paratroop drops in the hours between midnight and dawn was hampered by the same factors that hampered the Allied drops: the darkness, the scattered nature of the landings, the breakdown of communication when telephone lines were cut by roaming paratroopers, the fog of a night action in which reports arriving at headquarters were contradictory, impossible to verify, impossible to synthesize into a coherent tactical picture. Some reports said paratroopers had landed in specific locations. Other reports contradicted those reports. Some reports described large organized forces, others described small isolated groups moving through fields. All of this was true, in different places, at different moments. And the German command apparatus at divisional and corps level spent the hours before dawn trying to assemble these fragments into something that could be acted on, and largely failed. What the fragmentary reports did accomplish was to alert the German coastal defenders that something was happening. Not the invasion necessarily, not yet. The senior commanders were still cautious about that assessment, but something large and coordinated and serious. The phone calls that reached Werner Schreiber's command post in the hours before dawn did not say, "The invasion is here." They said, "There are paratroopers, and we do not know where or how many, and remain in your positions and wait for further orders." The orders to do something other than remain in position and wait never came, because the situation was moving too fast and in too many directions for any coherent order to be formulated. Heinrich Baum heard the aircraft from his position above the Gold Beach sector and felt something move through him that he would later describe in the memoir fragment recovered by his grandson after his death in 1989 as a recognition, not a rational assessment, but a bodily understanding, the kind of knowing that lives below thought, in the stomach and the hands. He did not think, "This is the invasion." He felt, "This is the thing we have been waiting for." And he was afraid, the way you are afraid when the thing you have been dreading actually arrives, and the period of dread is over, and what replaces it is not relief, but something harder. He checked his rifle. He checked it again. He looked out at the dark sea. Werner Schreiber, in his position above the Omaha sector, heard the guns begin before he heard the aircraft clearly. The anti-aircraft batteries along the coast, opening up at the formations passing overhead, filling the sky to the south and west with streams of tracer fire that illuminated the cloud base in flickering orange. He could see, at intervals, the darker shapes of aircraft feet visible against the brief illumination of the flak. He could not see the paratroopers falling. He would not know until dawn how many of them there were, how widely they had been scattered, how the disorientation of night drops, and German flak had distributed them across an area of more than 2,000 square kilometers in a pattern that bore only loose resemblance to the intended drop zones. He did know that the telephones were beginning to ring. The German communication system along the Norman coast on the night of June 5th to 6th is, in retrospect, a case study in the catastrophic consequences of command structures designed for a different kind of war. The Wehrmacht had built its operational habits around a principle of rapid, aggressive decision-making, the Auftragstactic tradition of mission-based command, in which commanders at every level were empowered to make decisions within the framework of their orders without waiting for explicit authorization from above. This system had served them extraordinarily well in the wars of rapid maneuver that had defined German military success between 1939 and 1942. It was less well suited to the specific challenge of June 6, 1944. The problem was Hitler. More precisely, the problem was the way Hitler's personality had distorted the command structure of the Wehrmacht over 4 years of war. The Panzers, the armoured reserve divisions that represented Germany's only real operational counterpunch to an Allied landing, were not under Rommel's command. They were under the control of OKW, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the High Command, which meant in practical terms that they could only be committed with Hitler's personal authorization. And Hitler, on the night of June 5th to 6th, was asleep at the Berghof in Bavaria. He had been given sedatives. He was not to be disturbed. The paratroopers were falling from the sky above Normandy. The telephone lines were buzzing with fragmentary and contradictory reports. German officers at every level, from battalion to army group, were trying to assemble a coherent picture from the noise. And the darkness and the scattered contacts with Allied airborne forces who were themselves disoriented and operating in isolation from their own command structures. And at the top of the German command chain, the one man whose authorization was required for the armored reserve to move was asleep, and no one was willing to wake him. The panzer reserves would not be released until the afternoon of June 6. By then, the arithmetic of the landing would have already resolved in ways that no armoured counterattack could correct. The men in the resistance nests did not know any of this on the night of June 5th. They knew only the sound of aircrafty and the beginning of phone calls and the particular tightening in the chest that comes from the collision of long-anticipated danger with the complete inability to know exactly what form it is taking. Werner Schreiber, in his position above Omaha, put his eye to his scope and looked at the dark sea, which told him nothing. He breathed slowly. He waited. The naval bombardment began before dawn. The darkness above the English Channel on the morning of June 6, 1944, was still nearly complete when the ships began to appear. This requires some perspective to grasp fully. The Allied naval force assembled for Operation Overlord was the largest armada in human history, 6,900 ships, ranging from battleships of 50,000 tons displacement to small landing crayfish 40 feet long, 1,100 warships, 4,000 transport vessels, more than 130,000 men afloat, waiting to cross the beach. The fleet had assembled in the darkness south of England and had crossed the Channel through the night, and it arrived off the Norman coast as the sky was beginning to lighten in the east, in the particular grey of pre-dawn that turns the sea the colour of old pewter. The Germans saw the ships before they heard the guns. There is a testimony from Hauptmann Werner Pluskat, an artillery officer in the 352nd Division, who was looking out from his observation post in a bunker above Omaha Beach at approximately 5 in the morning. He had been awake all night, disturbed by the reports of paratroopers and the noise of aircraft feet, trying to determine whether this was the beginning of the invasion or another night of confused reports that would resolve into nothing significant by morning. He put his binoculars to the sea. What he saw was the entire horizon moving. He would later describe it, and the description has entered the historical record with the weight of something almost mythological, as a grey mass, as far as the eye could see. 5,000 ships visible from a single observation point. The geometry of it was beyond military calculation. He picked up his telephone and called his division headquarters and said, in words that have been preserved across the decades, "There must be 10,000 ships out there." He was told he was exaggerating. He was not. For the snipers in their positions, the sight of the fleet was a different kind of experience than for the officers in the command bunkers who were trying to process it in terms of tactical response and communication to higher headquarters. The sniper's relationship to what he sees through a scope is intimate and immediate. He is not translating what he sees into report language or tactical assessment, but holding it in his vision with the specific attentiveness of a hunter who must remain absolutely still while everything around him is in motion. Heinrich Baum, above the Gold Beach sector, pressed his eye to his scope in the gathering light and moved it slowly across the sea. He would later write, in the same memoir fragment that survived him, that the first thing he felt looking at that fleet was not fear, but something closer to a strange, vertiginous awe. He had known the Allies were coming. Everyone had known the Allies were coming. The question of when had occupied the German command for 2 years, but knowing that something will happen and seeing it happen are different experiences, and what he saw through that scope in the pre-dawn of June 6th was the difference between those two experiences made visible solid. Enormous, and approximately 7 kilometers offshore and closing. He counted the ships visible in his scope's field of view. He counted 43 before he stopped, because the counting seemed suddenly beside the point. Then the guns opened up. The naval bombardment of the Normandy beaches began at approximately 5:50 in the morning of June 6, 1944, and continued for approximately 40 minutes before the first landing crayfeet touched the shore. The numbers attached to that bombardment have a kind of abstract enormity that the imagination has difficulty converting into something experiential. The Allied fleet fired approximately 5,000 tons of shells in those 40 minutes, a weight of ordnance delivered with the systematic thoroughness of men who understood that the soldiers in the landing crayfeet behind them would face those beaches in 40 minutes, and that the batteries and the bunkers and the positions on those beaches needed to be reduced as completely as possible before that moment arrived. The experience of receiving a naval bombardment from inside a reinforced concrete fortification is an experience that exists at the outer limits of what the human nervous system was designed to process. The shells from the Allied battleships and cruisers were large. The 14-inch shells fired by the American battleships weighed nearly 600 kilograms each and traveled to the shore at velocities that outpaced any possible awareness of their approach. They simply arrived, the sound of their passage a thunderous ripple of disturbed air that reached the ears of feet the shell had already struck or passed, so that the men in the positions lived in a perpetual present tense of consequence, without cause, impact without approach, result without warning. The 12-inch shells, the 8-inch shells from the cruisers, the 5-inch shells from the destroyers, and below all of it, the sustained mechanical percussion of rocket batteries firing from specialized landing ships. The landing crayfeet tank rockets that each carried over 1,000 rockets and could saturate a beach in seconds with a curtain of steel and fire. The American battleship USS Texas, firing from approximately 14 kilometers offshore, was delivering shells that were powerful enough to penetrate several meters of reinforced concrete before detonating. The USS Nevada, the USS Arkansas. These were ships that had been built for a different era of naval warfare, the era of fleet engagement, of ships fighting ships at long range across open ocean, and they were now turned broadside to the French coast and firing into hillsides, which was not what they had been designed for, but they were very good at it regardless. The combined weight of Allied naval gunfire against the Norman coast in the 40 minutes of the preliminary bombardment represented a delivery of explosive energy that exceeded anything previously concentrated against a comparable stretch of defended coastline, and yet the concrete in many of the positions held. This is the thing that both sides found extraordinary in different ways. The Allied planners had assigned significant weight to the preliminary bombardment in their calculations for the assault. They had expected it to suppress or destroy a substantial proportion of the German defensive positions, particularly the artillery batteries that could reach the landing crayfeet. The bombardment had done this to a degree, but the resistance nests, the individual bunker complexes that housed the machine guns and the artillery pieces and the snipers and the ordinary riflemen, had been built with 2 and 3 feet of reinforced concrete over their heads, and had been constructed with specific attention to angles that reduced direct hit probability. The shells landed on them, the shells detonated around them, the concrete cracked, and the lights failed and the men inside were shaken and deafened and terrified. But the concrete did not, in most cases, fail completely. What the concrete could not protect against was the cumulative psychic weight of what was happening. Werner Schreiber, in the darkness of his position with his hand on his rifle, and the world vibrating around him, experienced what he would later describe as a complete suspension of the self, a state in which the conscious mind retreated somewhere behind the body, and the body simply endured, registering each concussion as a fact without meaning, absorbing the physical reality of the bombardment without processing it in any way that resembled thought. He was aware of the smell of the concrete dust knocked loose from the ceiling by the impacts. He was aware of the warmth of the rifle stock against his palm. He was aware, at a remove, of someone in the position, he could not see who in the darkness, making sounds that might have been praying or might have been something wordless that simply needed to come out. He stayed still. He kept his hand on the rifle. This is not courage in any heroic sense. It is the body's refusal to allow the mind's awareness of its situation to become fully operative. Because the full operation of a mind that understands what is happening to it in those 40 minutes of naval bombardment would be incompatible with continued function. The suspension of the self was protective. It was also a form of military training made manifest. Years of conditioning to maintain position, to not break, to trust the concrete. And the plan and the belief that the bombardment would eventually end, and when it ended, there would be something to do besides endure. There were positions that did not hold. Some bunkers were struck directly by large caliber naval shells, and their inhabitants died in the concrete, which became their tomb. Some positions were struck by multiple hits in sequence, and the structure eventually failed. Some men in positions that remained intact were killed by blast effects or penetrating fragments, or the concussive pressure of rounds detonating on the exterior wall immediately adjacent to the embrasure. The German casualty lists for the bombardment phase of June 6, 1944, include hundreds of men who died before a single Allied soldier set foot on the beach. 40 minutes. 2,400 seconds, each one arriving with the sound of geological violence and departing into the next. When it stopped, the silence was almost worse. The soldiers in the landing crayfield had been at sea for hours. This is a fact that the German perspective rarely had occasion to contemplate, but that matters to understanding what came ashore. The crossing had been rough. The English Channel in early June was not calm, and the flat-bottomed landing crayfield that carried the assault troops were designed for beach landing rather than seakeeping, and the men in them had spent the crossing soaked with spray, and many of them violently ill, packed together in steel boxes that offered no shelter from the sea, or the cold, or the awareness of what lay ahead. They had been awake all night. They were wet and cold and frightened, and in many cases physically depleted, before they ever reached the beach. This matters because what the German defenders saw emerging from those landing crayfield was not the composed, confident force of the invasion posters, but something more complicated and more human. Men who had been through something difficult already, and who were now being asked to do something harder than the difficult thing they had already done. Men who stumbled in the surf, weighed down by equipment that could drown them if they fell. Men who ran toward a beach under fire and fell, and sometimes didn't get up, and sometimes kept running. And the ones who kept running were the ones who mattered, because the ones who kept running were already at the base of the seawall or the wire before the smoke had cleared. For Heinrich Baum, above Gold Beach, the moment the landing crayfield opened their ramps was the moment the abstraction of the fleet became the reality of individual men. He put his eye to the scope. He was looking at approximately 800 meters to the first line of men entering the water from the ramps. 800 meters is a meaningful range for a rifle shot. Not impossible, but requiring precision of technique, correct estimation of wind, correct compensation for the slight upward angle from his elevated position. He had practiced shots at 800 meters. He was capable of them, given time and stability, and the right conditions. What he was not capable of was ignoring the fact that at 800 meters, through a 1.5 power scope, what he saw were men, specific men, individual men with specific shapes and gaits and ways of moving through the water. He breathed, he set his scope, he calculated the distance and the wind. The wind was coming from the northwest at approximately 8 to 10 kilometers per hour, which meant a slight leaf feet to right deflection adjustment, and he chose a target among the men coming off the nearest ramp, and he fired. He did not see where the shot went. The smoke and the chaos of the beach made confirmation impossible, and this was characteristic of the sniper experience on June 6, 1944. More broadly, the conditions were so far from ideal, the targets so numerous. the battlefield so saturated with fire and smoke and movement that the precise accounting of individual effect that defines the sniper's art in more controlled conditions was simply not available. He fired, he worked the bolt, he found a new target. He fired again. To understand what it meant to fire into those first waves, you have to understand something about the weight of what the men in those landing crayfish were carrying. Not just the physical weight, which was significant, but the weight of what they knew was coming. The Americans in the Higgins boats approaching Omaha had heard about Omaha. Some of them had seen the photographs, the aerial reconnaissance images of the beach with its bluffs, and its draws and its careful distribution of defensive positions. Some of them had been briefed in enough detail that they understood, on an intellectual level, what the beach offered to the men who had to cross it, and then they had climbed down the cargo nets into the landing crayfish anyway, because there was no alternative to climbing down, and they had crossed the channel in the dark, and the cold, and the spray, and they had waited. And now the ramp was going down and the morning light was coming up, and the sand was there, just there, past 100 meters of churned grey water. The first men off the ramps at Omaha entered water that was chest deep in places, waist deep in others. The tide was coming in. The obstacles planted by the German beach engineering teams, the steel stakes, the concrete pyramids, the Belgian gates with their telemines, were partially submerged, which meant the landing crayfish helmsman couldn't see them clearly enough to navigate around them all, and some of the crayfish were holed by obstacles and sank in the surf zone, and the men in them went into the water with their equipment, and some of them made it to shore, and some of them didn't. The men on the beach, the men who had made it through the surf, ran toward the seawall and the shingle bank and the base of the bluff, because it was the only movement that made tactical sense. The beach was killing ground, and forward was the only direction that offered any reduction in exposure. They ran in the face of machine gun fire from the bunker complexes on the bluffs, fire from the resistance nests to the flanks, fire from the draws, fire from positions that had survived the naval bombardment intact, and that were now fulfilling exactly the purpose they had been designed and sited and built for. The mathematics of those minutes are almost impossible to hold in the mind completely. At the peak of the initial landings, several thousand men were crossing several hundred meters of exposed beach, and the German positions on the bluffs above that beach had clear fields of fire across almost all of it, and the combination of machine guns and artillery and riflemen and the specific geography of Omaha created a situation in which the cost of crossing those 100 meters was, in the first hour, approximately 1 casualty for every 3 to 4 men who attempted it in some units. Companies that landed at full strength of 160 men found themselves at half strength before they reached the seawall. Schreiber fired through this. He could not see the individual consequence of each shot. He could see men fall, but on a beach where men were falling for many reasons, stumbling in the surf, taking cover, struck by fire from other positions, individual attribution was not possible. He was a single rifle in a defensive network of machine guns and mortars and artillery, and his contribution to the whole was not separable from the whole. He fired and reloaded and fired and reloaded, and kept his eye at the scope, and the smoke built, and the shapes in the crosshairs kept coming. The mathematics of what he was doing were clear and terrible. The beach at Gold was roughly 4 kilometers wide in the sector he covered. His effective range was perhaps 800 meters, perhaps 1,000 in ideal conditions. His field of fire through the embrasure gave him a lateral arc of perhaps 60 degrees, covering a significant portion of his assigned sector. He could fire approximately 8 rounds per minute with the bolt-action carabiner, though the practical rate in combat conditions, acquiring targets, confirming hits, managing the scope, was closer to 4 or 5 rounds per minute. He had 200 rounds in his position. Resupply was theoretically possible. Theoretically, in the time it took him to fire 100 rounds, perhaps 30 minutes, perhaps 40, he could have engaged perhaps 40 individual targets at ranges where accuracy was probable. The British landing forces at Gold Beach were approximately 25,000 strong. The arithmetic of one sniper against 25,000 men is not a calculation that resolves in the sniper's favour. It never was. Everyone knew it never was. He fired anyway, because the job was not to resolve the arithmetic. The job was to make the arithmetic cost as much as possible in time and confusion, and every minute of delay at the waterline was a minute that the German position remained viable, and the position remaining viable was the mission. And so he fired, and worked the bolt, and found a new target, and fired again. The landings at Omaha were different. This is not a small distinction. The difference between the experience of the German defenders at Omaha and the experience of their counterparts at Gold, Juno, Sword, and Utah is a difference that has been examined from the Allied perspective in enormous detail. The catastrophic casualties at Omaha, the near failure of the assault, the narrow margin by which the beach was taken at all, but has rarely been examined from the German side with the same attention. The German experience at Omaha was not simply that the defence succeeded better, it was that the defence succeeded in a way that the defenders themselves found almost disorienting, because the scale of what they were inflicting was visible to them in ways that the scale of an advancing assault is not usually visible from a prepared defensive position. The specific geography of Omaha Beach had been studied and exploited with considerable professional care. The beach itself, roughly 8 kilometers of sand ending in a shingle bank at the base of bluffs that rose 30 to 40 meters above the shoreline, was one of the least promising assault beaches in the invasion zone. There were only 5 exits from the beach, draws cut through the bluffs by streams, and all 5 were covered by German positions that had been sited with specific attention to the problem of an assault from the sea. The bluffs themselves provided elevation for German defenders and concealment from naval gunfire that was hard to depress far enough to reach the bunkers at the cliff tops. The preliminary bombardment had been significantly less effective at Omaha than at other beaches. The Allied bombers tasked with striking the beach defences had, in the interest of avoiding casualties among the approaching landing crayfish, released their bombs from high altitude in conditions of reduced visibility. Clouds obscured the target area and had added a delay to their release point that moved the impact area inland by several kilometers. The bombs struck fields. The bunkers remained intact. The naval gunfire had suppressed the defenders during the bombardment, but had not destroyed the positions. And the moment the guns life-footed the men in those positions, Schreiber among them, raised their heads and put their eyes to their sights and found the landing crayfish coming through the smoke toward a beach that had been cratered by falling artillery and surf conditions that had pushed the assault right and disordered the company and battalion organization that the assault plan depended on. Werner Schreiber, in his position above the eastern end of Omaha, watched the ramps drop, and the men come off and tried to process what he was seeing in a way that allowed him to continue doing his job. The beach below him filled with men who ran and fell, and ran and fell. Men who reached the shingle at the base of the bluff and pressed themselves against it and lay very still. Men who did not reach the shingle. The water at the shoreline was cold, 12 degrees Celsius, cold enough to impair motor function within minutes of immersion, cold enough to be dangerous to men who had been soaked with channel spray for 2 hours before they even entered it. Many of the men who fell in the surf at Omaha were pulled under by the weight of their equipment, 60 pounds, sometimes more, and did not come back up. Many of the men who fell on the beach were shot and lay where they fell, and the tide came in around them and the sea was running red. Schreiber did his job. He would say in his interrogation weeks later that he did not allow himself to see what he was doing in the terms available to a man looking directly at its consequences. He looked through the scope, and he saw shapes in his crosshairs, and he applied the technique, the breathing, the pressure, the follow-through, and then the shape was gone, and he found another shape and did it again. This is not cruelty, it is not callousness. It is the specific psychological mechanism that a human being constructs around himself when the gap between what he is trained to do and what he is actually doing becomes too wide to cross consciously. He was shooting shapes. The shapes happened to be men. The men at Omaha happened to be dying in numbers that would define a generation's understanding of what war costs. The first waves at Omaha sustained casualties that, by any conventional military calculation, should have caused the assault to fail. Some companies landed with 50% casualties within 15 minutes of touching the beach. Some landing crayfish were hit by artillery before their ramps dropped, and the men inside them went into 10 feet of surf already wounded, or were simply killed before the ramp ever opened. The shingle bank at the base of the bluffs filled with men who had made it that far, and could not go further, and the German defenders looked down at the men on the shingle and could see them sheltering, and the tidal flat between them and the shingle was open ground, and the weight of fire from the bluffs should have been decisive. It nearly was. There is a man named John Robert Slaughter whose name appears in the historical record of Omaha Beach with the kind of specificity that history occasionally grants to ordinary men who find themselves inside extraordinary events. He was a private from Roanoke, Virginia, 19 years old, 6 feet 5 inches tall. A physical fact that would have consequences on a beach where height above the waterline was measured in survival probability. He came off a landing crayfish in the first wave. He walked into the English Channel up to his neck and kept walking toward the shore, because there was no alternative to walking, and the men around him were falling, and the noise was total, and what he felt was not heroism, but a kind of fundamental refusal. Not the refusal of a man who has decided to be brave, but the refusal of a body that keeps moving because motion is the only way it knows to continue existing. From the German positions above, Slaughter and men like him were targets. From the American landing crayfish behind him, they were the assault. From the perspective of 5,000 years of military history, they were infantry going into a defended beach, which is one of the most expensive things a military force can do. The gap between these perspectives is not reconcilable. The experience is not translatable from one side of the gun to the other. The men who survived the first hour at Omaha were not the men who had the best plan. The plans were in tatters within 10 minutes, units mixed together, officers gone, landmarks on the beach swallowed by smoke. The men who survived were the men who kept moving. Sergeant William Steiber, Lieutenant Jimmy Monteith, Staff Sergeant Walter Ellis, names that would later appear on medals and citations and the monuments that were built on those bluffs years of feet of the bodies were buried, men who found the gaps in the wire and the seams in the fire plan and the narrow gullies where the German fields of fire were interrupted by folds in the terrain, and who went through those gaps with whatever men were close enough to follow. The gap between the eastern and western defensive positions at WN 62, the wider stand's nest directly above the dog-white sector of Omaha Beach, was approximately 200 meters of bluff face that was not covered by a machine gun position. The German defensive plan knew about this gap. The intention had been to place additional positions to cover it. The materials had not arrived. The men were not there. 200 meters of exposed bluff, and a small group of American soldiers found it in the smoke and the confusion of late morning. And they went up. From Werner Schreiber's position, he could see movement on the bluff to his west. He tried to engage, but the angle was wrong, and the smoke was thick and the movement was fragmentary, men appearing and disappearing in the brush, and his shots went into the smoke and he could not confirm anything. He kept firing. He kept working the bolt. He was down to his last 40 rounds. He had been firing for 3 hours. By noon on June 6, 1944, the mathematics of the beach positions had shifted in ways that the individual defenders could feel more than they could see. The German command structure at the level of the resistance nests was oriented outward, toward the sea, toward the beach, toward the threat coming from the water. The machine guns and artillery and snipers had been sighted with this orientation in mind, and it was the correct orientation for the first hours of the assault, when the threat was indeed coming from the water, and the defensive positions were doing their designed work. But the threat was beginning to come from multiple directions, and the positions were not equally well designed to address threats from inland. The American assault at Omaha, costly, disorganized, driven forward by the specific stubbornness of small groups of men, had by late morning established footholds at the top of the bluffs in several locations. Not a breakthrough, not a tide of men sweeping the German positions from the rear. Small groups. Platoon strength, sometimes less. Men who had gone up the draws or the cliff face and were now on top, looking down at the German positions from angles those positions had not been designed to defend against. At Gold Beach, the British 50th Infantry Division had achieved significantly more by noon. The German position there, while contested, had been penetrated at multiple points, and the armoured vehicles that had survived the landing, the DD tanks, the specialised armour of Hobart's funnies, the tanks and carriers that had made it from the water's edge to the beach without drowning, were moving inland. Heinrich Baum, in his position above the beach, could hear their engines. He could not see them through the embrasure. He could only hear them getting closer. The telephone line to his position's command post had stopped working at approximately 10 in the morning. He did not know exactly why. He assumed the wire had been cut by shell fire, which was probable. He assumed the command post was still there, which was less certain. He was receiving no orders and had no way to request them. He had his rifle and his remaining ammunition, roughly 60 rounds, and he had his position. He continued to fire at the beach, though by noon the beach itself was not the critical problem. The men at the beach had moved off it. The beach was empty of living men moving toward him. The threat was no longer from the sea. This is the specific, terrible clarity of the defensive sniper's experience in a position that is being overrun. Not overrun in the cinematic sense of a wave of men washing over a trench, but overrun in the more gradual and more disorienting sense of a position that slowly loses its connection to everything around it. The telephone dies. The adjacent position stops answering when you fire recognition signals. The sound of gunfire that was concentrated in front of you begins to come from the flank and then from behind. The world of the defensive position, which was once oriented toward the sea, becomes a perimeter. Then the perimeter becomes smaller. Heinrich Baum stayed in his position until approximately 2 in the afternoon. By then he could hear British voices, close. Too close for the embrasure's angle to address. He looked at his rifle. He looked at the embrasure. He thought about the mathematics. He put down the rifle. He raised his hands and pushed open the rear access hatch of the bunker. He walked into the light with his hands above his head. The British soldier who accepted his surrender was, by his own later description, about 20 years old, very tall, and very tired. Neither of them said anything. Baum was moved to the rear. His rifle remained in the bunker. The eastern beaches, Juno and Sword, were Canadian and British, and the German defenders there encountered the specific problem of facing assault forces that had studied the errors of Dieppe very carefully. The raid on Dieppe in August 1942 had been a disaster for the attacking forces and had provided the German defenders of the Norman coast with considerable confidence about the defensive value of their positions. A frontal assault on a defended port had been repelled with catastrophic losses, and the lesson drawn from Dieppe, incorrectly, as June 6, 1944 would demonstrate, was that defended coastline was essentially impregnable to amphibious assault. The Canadians at Juno Beach drew on Dieppe not as a source of confidence, but as a sourcebook of mistakes to avoid. They avoided most of them. The German defenders at the Juno Beach positions, men of the 716th Division, augmented by elements of the 21st Panzer Division in the area, faced a force that came onto the beach with armour support, that cleared the beach exits quickly, that had a momentum that the German positions were not fully designed to check. Obergefreiter Klaus Heinz held a position in a reinforced house in the village of Bernier-sur-Mer, one of the Norman coastal towns that the German defensive plan had incorporated into the wider Stansness system. He was 24, from Cologne, and he was not a trained sniper in any formal sense. He was a grenadier who had been placed in an elevated room in a requisitioned house with a rifle, and a field of fire that covered the beach approach and told to engage targets as they presented themselves. He had a scope. He had clear instructions. He was afraid in a way that had long since become indistinguishable from simple determination. The way that fear, held for long enough, stops being an emotion and becomes a climate. The Canadians came off the beach at approximately 8 in the morning and moved into the village by mid-morning. They came street by street, building by building, the way urban fighting always goes. Slowly, carefully, lethally, with the systematic attention of men who understood that every window was a potential firing position, and every alley was a potential ambush. Heinz heard them before he saw them. He could hear the sound of a town being cleared, the specific percussion of short bursts of fire, shouted commands in a language he couldn't understand, the crash of a door being breached, the answering fire of a defender, then silence, then the process moving to the next building. He stayed at his window. He fired at the men he could see in the street below. He hit 2 of them before they found the angle back to his position, and the next few minutes were very loud and very confined. He went to the floor and stayed there, and when it was over and the building was silent, he was not sure what had happened. And then a Canadian soldier appeared in the doorway with a rifle, and Heinz was on the floor with his hands against the wood, and there was nothing to calculate anymore. He was alive. That was the whole of it. On Utah Beach, the westernmost American landing zone, the mathematics had resolved in a way that the German defenders could not have anticipated, and would have found, if they had known it, grimly ironic. The landing crayfeet assigned to Utah had been pushed south by the channel current 2 kilometers south of the intended beach, into a sector where the German defenses were significantly weaker than the planned landing area, where the dunes were lower and the obstacles fewer, and the fire from the resistance nests less concentrated. This error, an accidental 2-kilometer navigation mistake, saved an enormous number of American lives and contributed directly to the rapid success of the Utah landing. A brigadier general named Theodore Roosevelt Jr., 5 feet 6 years old, the only general officer to land in the first wave, carrying a walking stick because his arthritis made the terrain difficult, assessed the situation on the wrong beach and made the decision that has been quoted in almost every subsequent account of Utah: "We'll start the war from right here." The decision was pragmatic and correct, and almost certainly saved hundreds of lives by accepting the error and exploiting the opportunity it had accidentally created, rather than attempting to redirect the assault to the planned position. The German defenders at the Utah sector, who had prepared to engage an assault at the originally planned position, were not engaged with the intensity they had expected. Some of them watched the American landing from positions that were outside the effective range of the assault, and found themselves in the specific, disorienting situation of men who had prepared for a fight that arrived somewhere else. They were not tested as their counterparts at Omaha were tested. They were outflanked and bypassed and left feet behind the advancing American line. The mathematics of their position resolved not through catastrophe, but through irrelevance, which is its own kind of ending. The 4th Infantry Division was off Utah Beach and moving inland by late morning. They linked up with elements of the 101st Airborne, those paratroopers who had fallen from the sky the night before, and had been fighting in small isolated groups across the Norman countryside since before dawn by a noon. The western end of the Allied landing was becoming a connected front. At the eastern end, the British 6th Airborne Division had seized the bridges at Biennoville and Ranville in the night, securing the flank of the Sword Beach landing and preventing any counterattack from the east. The men who had taken Pegasus Bridge, the Horsa Glider assault by D Company of the Oxford, and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry had achieved their objective so quickly and so completely that when the commander of the German garrison at the bridge arrived by bicycle to inspect the situation, he cycled directly into the hands of the British troops before realizing what had happened. The story of June 6, 1944, contains within its immensity an infinite number of these specific, strange, entirely human moments. Men on bicycles encountering history, navigation errors that become tactical masterstrokes, abandoned plans that become the basis for victory, the vast machinery of the largest amphibious operation ever attempted, and within it, the irreducible specificity of individual human beings responding to the immediate moment with whatever they had. By the afternoon of June 6th, the German defensive position along the Norman coast had fragmented into isolated islands of resistance. Individual Widerstands Nester that remained in German hands, surrounded by or bypassed by Allied forces that were consolidating the beaches and beginning to push inland. The coordinated coastal defense that the German plan had envisioned no longer existed as a system. What remained were pockets, strong points, men in concrete boxes who still had ammunition and were not yet outflanked, and who continued to do their jobs. Werner Schreiber was one of those men. He had expended all his primary ammunition by early afternoon, and had found an additional 550 rounds in a storage locker in the rear of his position. Ammunition intended for another rifleman who was no longer at the position, for reasons Schreiber did not know. He was firing sparingly at selected targets, the way a man fires when he is aware that each round is finite and the supply of rounds is ending. He could hear fighting behind him, to the south, inland, where groups of Americans who had come over the bluffs were working through the thin German positions in the Norman countryside. He could not see the fighting. He could only hear it. His position was still intact. The concrete was damaged, cracked in places by the naval bombardment, one corner of the roof showing a fracture that he had watched with attention all day, but fundamentally sound. The embrasure faced the sea. The sea was no longer the threat. The beach below him, which had been the focus of his attention, and his fire for 7 hours, was now a place of organized American activity. Engineers clearing obstacles, medics working among the fallen, vehicles unloading from the LSTs that had come in behind the assault waves. The assault had passed through and beyond his position. He was no longer a sniper covering a beach. He was a point on a map that the advancing American force was going to eventually reach from a direction he was not set up to engage. He thought about this for some time. He thought about his family in Dusseldorf. He thought about the letter he had written to his mother the previous evening, which was still in his breast pocket, which had not been mailed, which might or might not be mailed now depending on how the next few hours resolved. He thought about the Eastern Front, and what it had looked like and felt like, and he thought about this beach below him, and the colour of the water at dawn, and the sound the ocean made before the fleet appeared. He thought about the 14 men he had confirmed, and the men a feta that he had not confirmed and would not count, and he did not think about this for long. He fired his last rounds at approximately 4 in the afternoon, not at specific targets. There were no specific targets presenting themselves at the ranges he could engage, but at movement in the gully below, and to his west, where he thought he had seen American soldiers working their way toward his position's blind side. He did not know if he hit anyone. He worked the bolt through 550 rounds, and then the bolt worked on an empty chamber, and the rifle was as useful as a stick. He sat in the damaged concrete of his position in the later theatre known of June 6, 1944, with an empty rifle and the sound of a battle that had moved past him in every direction. And he thought about what came next with the specific, exhausted clarity of a man who has been doing one thing very intently for a very long time and has now come to the end of that thing. He did not surrender immediately. He waited until evening, until the sounds of fighting to the south had diminished, until the light was failing and the beach below was quieter, until the mathematics of his position had resolved so completely that there was nothing feet to calculate. Then he opened the rear access hatch. Then he raised his hands. Then he walked into the cooler air of a Norman evening, and he was a prisoner. He was not dead. He had not expected to be alive. These two facts, which seemed like they should be simple, took him a long time to reconcile. By the end of June 6, 1944, the Allied forces had established a beachhead along roughly 80 kilometers of the Norman coast. The 5 beaches, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword, were in Allied hands, though not all of them were fully secure. Not all of the planned objectives had been reached, and the cost had been enormous. Approximately 10,000 Allied soldiers had been killed, wounded, or were missing by nightfall, with Omaha accounting for the largest share of that cost, somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 casualties in a single day on a single beach. The numbers remain uncertain even now, 80 years later, because the record-keeping of catastrophe is imprecise. On the German side, the casualties were also severe. The 352nd Division, which had borne the brunt of the Omaha assault, had been effectively destroyed as an operational formation by the end of June. The 716th Division had suffered losses of approximately 20% killed or captured, with the remainder retreating to the south. The Atlantic Wall in Normandy had been breached at every point. The fortifications that had taken 2 years to build, and staff and supply, had been pierced in less than 24 hours at a cost that, while appalling, was absorbable by an Allied force with the departments and the logistics and the strategic reserves that the German defenders could never match. The Panzer reserves that had not been committed, the 15th Army at Pas de Calais that had not been moved because Hitler and the German High Command continued to believe, for weeks after June 6th, that the Normandy landing was a feint and the real assault was still coming at Calais, a belief sustained partly by Allied deception operations, so sophisticated they deserve their own telling, and partly by a German High Command that had so thoroughly convinced itself of the strategic logic of a Calais landing that it struggled to abandon the expectation even in the face of evidence. The Panzer reserves arrived in Normandy too slowly, piecemeal, committed into a situation that was already past the point where armoured counterattack could dislodge what the Allies had established. The mathematics of the campaign, as opposed to the mathematics of the single day, were never in question after the evening of June 6th. The men who had held the resistance nests knew this, even if they could not articulate it in the language of operational analysis. They knew it the way soldiers always know the things that matter most, not from briefings or maps, but from the specific quality of the ground beneath them, and the sound of the fighting and the direction that the sounds were moving. The sounds were moving inland, away from the beaches, and the men in the concrete positions along the shore were being leaf-feet behind. There is a village in Normandy called Colleville-sur-Mer that sits on the bluffs above the eastern end of Omaha Beach. Before June 6, 1944, it was a small Norman agricultural village with a church and a square and the particular unhurried character of coastal French towns that have been there longer than most of the institutions that claim authority over them. A feta, June 6, 1944. It became something else. It became the place above which the American military cemetery was established, 172 acres of former farmland, planted with 9,387 white Carrara marble crosses and stars of David, each one marking a soldier who had died in the Normandy campaign, or the operations that followed. The cemetery is one of the most visited places in France. More than 1 million people walk through it each year. They walk in a particular kind of silence, the silence of people who are aware of something very large in the space around them, something that resists the language of tourism and requires instead a different kind of engagement, the engagement of people facing something they were not directly part of, but for which they feel, in some not entirely definable way, responsible. The German military cemetery in Normandy is at La Cambe, 7 kilometers south of the American cemetery. It holds 21,160 German soldiers, buried under flat basalt crosses, in a design that is intentionally less grand than the American cemetery. The basalt is darker, the crosses lower, the landscape less manicured, not as a gesture of dishonor, but as an acknowledgement that these graves carry a different moral weight. The German War Graves Commission, which maintains the cemetery, has written that the site is intended to be a place of mourning and of reconciliation, not a place of victory or national pride. There is no German equivalent of the heroic narrative that American culture has constructed around D-Day. There is only the flat stone and the names and the question of what the names mean, which is a question without a comfortable answer. Among the names in that cemetery are men who were in the resistance nests on June 6, 1944, men who fired and were fired at and did not walk away, men who died in the concrete of their positions or in the withdrawal south, or in the weeks of fighting in the Norman hedgerow country that followed the landing. The 352nd Division lost a significant fraction of its strength in the first week alone. The 716th Division was essentially rebuilt from scratch. The geography of Normandy, the bocage, the thick hedgerows that had been growing for centuries, and that turned every field into a defended position, made the German withdrawal costly in ways that the German command had not fully anticipated, and that would consume formations that had survived June 6. Werner Schreiber survived the war. He was held in an American prisoner of war camp in England until 1946, then repatriated to a Germany that was no longer a country in any meaningful sense, but a problem, a project of reconstruction administered by 4 occupying powers, a society that had to look at what it had done and find a way to continue existing. He returned to Dusseldorf and found that the house he had grown up in had been destroyed in a bombing raid in 1944. His mother was alive. His brother had not come back from the Eastern Front. He never spoke publicly about his time on the Norman coast. This was common. The men who had fought on the German side of June 6, 1944, returned to a country that was, justifiably, not interested in processing their experiences as a form of honoured service. The war had been started by Germans and had produced atrocities that required reckoning before they required commemoration. The individual soldier's experience was lost in the larger moral accounting, not because it was unimportant, but because the culture had more important work to do. He died in 1989, the same year the Berlin Wall fell. His granddaughter, going through his papers a few to his death, found a brief handwritten account, 11 pages, in his careful schoolboy script, of his time above Omaha Beach. She donated it to a regional archive in the Rhineland. It is not widely read. It contains nothing strategic, nothing analytically significant. It contains the experience of a young man who was very still and very cold and very frightened. and who did what he was trained to do inside an event too large to comprehend from where he was positioned. Heinrich Baum was in British captivity until 1947 and returned to Germany to work as a schoolteacher in Bavaria. He taught mathematics. He taught it for 23 years, retired in 1971, and wrote his memoir fragment in the early 1980s when he was in his 60s, and the world had changed enough that examining these things seemed more possible than it once had. He described, in the memoir, looking out at the fleet in the pre-dawn and counting the ships visible in his scope's field of view and stopping at 43, and he described this not as a memory of fear, but as a memory of a fundamental alteration, the moment when the scale of something exterior exceeded anything he could accommodate internally, when the war stopped being a thing happening around him and became a thing he was inside. He died in 1997. The memoir fragment runs to 40 pages. His grandson found it in a shoebox. Klaus Heinz, who had been in the house in Bernier-sur-Mer, returned to Cologne, which had been more than 60% destroyed by the Allied bombing campaign. He worked in reconstruction for 20 years and then in building maintenance until his retirement. He did not write about Normandy. He did not, as far as his family knew, think about it more than was unavoidable. He was alive, and he had a family, and the specific work of being alive and having a family occupied most of the available space in a life that the war had not destroyed, which is not the same as saying the war had left him intact. The intactness of survivors is always partial, the mathematics of what was lost. In these men, in the men they killed, in the men who died around them, is not a calculation that comes to a clean answer. It compounds, the way all real debts compound, across time, across generations, into a sum that no individual accounting can fully capture. The German perspective on D-Day is not a comfortable perspective to inhabit, and the discomfort is appropriate. These were men who served a regime of monstrous criminality, whose war of conquest and occupation had produced suffering at a scale that makes the casualties of June 6, 1944, immense as they are, a fraction of the larger accounting. The men in the resistance nests were not the architects of that criminality. Most of them were not its enthusiasts. Most of them were soldiers doing what soldiers do, which is what they are told, and what their training makes possible, and what the immediate tactical situation requires. This is not exoneration. It is description. The distinction between description and exoneration matters, and it is a distinction that the comfortable narratives of D-Day tend to collapse by simply not making room for the complexity. The story of June 6, 1944, is commonly told as a story of liberation, which it was. It is commonly told as a story of Allied valour and sacrifice, which it also was. It is less commonly told as a story of German soldiers pressed into the concrete of a defended coastline, who watched an armada cross their horizon and felt the mathematics of their situation resolve against them before the first wave hit the beach, and who did their jobs anyway, not because they believed in what they were fighting for, though some of them did, but because the job was the only thing leafy to do. There is a particular quality to the memory of men who were on the losing side of the largest military operation in history, and who survived it. It is a memory that has nowhere obvious to go. The victor's narrative of June 6, 1944 is one of the most complete and thoroughly institutionalized narratives in modern Western culture. The beaches, the parachutes, the beaches, the flags, the beaches, the monuments. Every detail of the Allied experience has been examined, recreated, commemorated, dramatized. The Higgins boats, the hedgehog obstacles, the Rangers at Pointe du Hoc, the specific geography of each exit from Omaha Beach. These things exist in cultural memory with an intensity that will probably not diminish for as long as there are people alive who knew people who were there. The German memory has no such institution behind it. It has the graves at Lacombe, lower and darker than the graves above Omaha. It has the interrogation records and the prisoner memoirs and the occasional carefully qualified regimental history produced by veterans associations that no longer exist. It has the specific and uncomfortable problem of any narrative that tries to give human weight to men who fought for something that, in its totality, was indefensible. You can humanize these men, and the record demands that you do because they were human, without vindicating what they served. The humanization is not the same as the vindication. The record asks that we hold both things at once. What the record also shows, if you look at it carefully, is the extent to which the men in those positions understood, by the end of June 6, 1944, that the thing they had been defending was over. Not the war. The war would continue for 11 more months and would consume millions more lives in France and the Low Countries, and Germany itself. But the strategic viability of the German position in the West, the arithmetic of the beachhead, the possibility of driving the Allies back into the sea, all of this was over by nightfall of June 6th, and the men who had been in the resistance nests knew it, even if the men in the higher command echelons were not ready to say so. The specific knowledge of a defeated man on a particular evening is a kind of knowledge that resists generalization. Werner Schreiber walking out of his bunker with his hands raised. Heinrich Baum walking out of his bunker with his hands raised. Klaus Heinz lying on the floor of a requisitioned house in Bernier-sur-Mer. These are individual moments. They do not sum to a lesson. They do not resolve into a teachable truth about war or sacrifice or the nature of defeat. They are simply what they are, men at the end of something, holding whatever they had left, facing what came next. What came next was very long, the years of reconstruction. The silence about certain things, the specific German experience of having to reckon as a society with the full weight of what the regime had done, which was an entirely legitimate reckoning, which absorbed the moral and psychological space that might otherwise have been available for examining the individual experiences of the men who had served it. The veterans of Normandy came home to a country that needed to understand itself as having been fundamentally wrong about fundamental things, and within that large and necessary project, the experience of individual soldiers in individual positions on individual days was a very small part, appropriately so, but the experience exists. It is in the archives. It is in the 11 pages in Werner Schreiber's careful schoolboy hand, and in Heinrich Baum's 40 pages, and in the interrogation records maintained by American intelligence officers who sat across from these men in the weeks of to June 1944, and asked them questions and wrote down the answers in the dispassionate language of military assessment. It is in the unit diaries, and the regimental histories, and the testimony of men who have mostly now been dead for 30 or 40 years. It is the experience of a specific kind of precision, a trained, technical, demanding precision, brought to bear inside a situation that precision could not resolve. The sniper's art is premised on control of breathing, of heartbeat, of trigger pressure, of windage calculation, and range estimation. It is premised on the ability to make the world, for the duration of the shot, consist of nothing but the relationship between the crosshair and the target. Everything outside that relationship is temporarily suspended. Everything outside that relationship is managed by training and discipline and the specific mental architecture of a man who has decided to be very good at a very difficult thing. What June 6, 1944 imposed on those men was the impossibility of that suspension. The world outside the crosshair would not be managed. It kept arriving, in the form of a fleet that filled the horizon, in the form of naval shells that turned the concrete into something alive, in the form of thousands of men who kept coming off the landing crayfeet and kept crossing the beach, regardless of the fire, who fell and got up and fell and didn't get up, and the next wave came off the next ramp and kept coming. The world outside the crosshair was too large for the crosshair to contain, and the men who understood this earliest were the men who put down their rifles and raised their hands, because they understood that the arithmetic had resolved, and the continued performance of precision was no longer a service to any outcome that mattered. The arithmetic of the campaign was simple and brutal, and had been simple and brutal for a long time before. June 6th, 1944. The United States alone was producing approximately 47,000 aircraft feet per year in 1944. Germany was producing approximately 39,000 for the entire war. The United States was launching new merchant ships at a rate that exceeded German submarine sinkings by a factor of 3 to 1. The Soviet Union had survived the German attempt at annihilation and was now driving west with an industrial and manpower base that dwarfed anything the Wehrmacht could field against it. Britain, exhausted and strained, was nevertheless producing arms and training soldiers and maintaining the intelligence networks that had deceived the German High Command so thoroughly that the 15th Army sat on the Pas-de-Calais coast for weeks ahead of D-Day, watching for the real invasion that never came. Against this arithmetic, the concrete of the Atlantic Wall and the patience of its defenders and the precision of the men in the resistance nests were not insufficient. They were irrelevant on the scale that mattered. They mattered only on the scale of individual minutes and individual hours, and the lives that were spent in the gaining of those minutes and hours. And those lives were real, and the spending of them was real, and the mathematics of that spending is the mathematics that the white crosses above Omaha record in stone. The arithmetic of survival is this: you do not escape the calculation. You can delay it. You can complicate it. You can bring to it every skill and preparation and determination available to you, and make it cost more than it expected to cost. But you cannot rewrite it. The numbers are what they are. The tide is what it is. The tide came in on June 6th, 1944, and it kept coming, and it has not gone back out. It ended as these things end, not with a surrender in a formal sense, but with a gradual cessation, a position falling silent, because the last round had been fired, a man walking out with his hands raised, a phone line going dead. It ended in small moments distributed across a coastline of 80 kilometers over the course of a day. Not a single ending. Hundreds of endings. The end of one man's long wait. The end of another man's position in the dark. History remembers the fleet, and the paratroopers, and the generals, and the names cut into the white marble of the cemetery above the sea. This is correct. These things deserve to be remembered. They are the record of an enormous sacrifice in the service of something worth sacrificing for. They are also, for the culture that maintains and transmits them, a source of a particular comfort, the comfort of a past that had a clear moral structure, a clean division between what was right and what was wrong, a day on which the good crossed the water and the evil waited in concrete, and the good won. The comfort is earned. The day was what it was, and the cause was what it was, and the men who came across that water deserved the monuments that were built above the beaches where they died. But somewhere in the record, there is also a man pressing his face against cold glass in a concrete box, looking through the eyepiece at a sea that the previous morning had been empty, watching the horizon fill with something so large it fell outside the categories available to him. Watching it and knowing, in the way that bodies know before minds have caught up, what it meant, that the thing they had been waiting for had come, that the waiting was over, that what replaced the waiting was not resolution but immensity. He breathed, he aimed, he did what he had been trained to do. The tide came in,